They laughed at the American bombers. At first, the Viet Cong believed the jungle itself would protect them, a green ocean that swallowed everything foreign and metallic. The canopy hid their movements, the mud concealed their traps, and the tunnels below were said to stretch endlessly beneath the earth. They whispered that no weapon made by man could ever burn the jungle. It was their home, their camouflage, their shield. But then, the sky began to tremble. From far beyond the horizon came this sound, deep, distant, rolling like thunder, but colder, heavier. The B-52 Stratofortresses were already there, miles above the clouds, unseen by the men below. Each one carried over 30 tons of bombs, and when they released their payload, it wasn't an explosion. It was a transformation. The jungle didn't burn. It vanished. A wall of shock waves rolled across the land, flattening trees as if they were blades of grass. The air itself seemed to scream. Viet Cong fighters were thrown into the air, their weapons and bodies swallowed by dust and flame. From above, the earth looked alive, rippling, boiling, turning into a landscape of endless craters. For those who survived, time stopped. There were no cries, no commands, only the deafening roar that erased everything they knew. What had once been a green paradise turned into a gray wasteland. Trees replaced by smoke, life replaced by silence. The Americans had just rewritten the laws of war, and in that moment, even the most fearless guerrillas learned what true terror sounded like. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the early days of the Vietnam War. They laughed at the American bombers. At first, the Viet Cong believed the jungle itself would protect them, a green ocean that swallowed everything foreign and metallic. The canopy hid their movements, the mud concealed their traps, and the tunnels below were said to stretch endlessly beneath the earth. They whispered that no weapon made by man could ever burn the jungle. It was their home, their camouflage, their shield. But then, the sky began to tremble. From far beyond the horizon came the sound, deep, distant, rolling like thunder, but colder, heavier. The B-52 Stratofortresses were already there, miles above the clouds, unseen by the men below. Each one carried over 30 tons of bombs, and when they released their payload, it wasn't an explosion. To understand how the skies over Vietnam became engines of destruction, we have to return to the mid-1960s, a time when America still believed it could bend a distant war to its will. By 1964, the United States had poured thousands of troops into South Vietnam. Washington promised that advanced technology, air power, and sheer industrial strength would crush the communist insurgency within months. The Viet Cong, they said, were farmers with rifles, men hiding in trees and tunnels, fighting a modern army with jungle tricks. Victory seemed inevitable. But on the ground, the reality was very different. The jungle was not a battlefield. It was a living organism, dense, humid, impenetrable, a place where machines rusted, radios failed, and men disappeared. The Viet Cong knew it intimately. They built entire networks beneath it, tunnels, weapon caches, hospitals, even command centers. To the Americans above, the enemy seemed to materialize out of thin air, strike, and vanish. Every patrol, every convoy, every firebase in South Vietnam lived under constant threat. Mines exploded under the wheels of trucks, ambushes shredded columns of soldiers, helicopters lifted off from bases one morning and never returned. It wasn't a conventional war. It was a war of exhaustion, fought inch by inch against an enemy that refused to show its face. By 1965, frustration turned to fury. The Pentagon believed that if the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong could not be rooted out by infantry, they would be buried by air power. The answer, they decided, was Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign that would strike the North relentlessly. But even as bombs fell on Hanoi and Haiphong, the South remained a nightmare.
The Viet Cong continued to move freely through thick forests and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a lifeline of supplies running from the north through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. The problem was clear. The jungle itself was the enemy. It shielded troops, hid camps, absorbed sound, and swallowed evidence. Pilots couldn't see what they were hitting. Even napalm, the most feared weapon of the era, could only clear small areas. Commanders needed something larger, something that could erase entire regions of forest and make the Viet Cong's underground world collapse. That was when the name Arclight appeared on the operations map. Operation Arclight was designed around one aircraft, the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. Originally built to carry nuclear bombs across continents, the B-52 was a Cold War weapon, enormous, intimidating, and designed to never be seen up close by its enemies. But now, it would be used for something far more brutal, dropping thousands of conventional bombs on the jungles of Vietnam. Each bomber could carry over 30 tons of bombs, each weighing 750 pounds. A single B-52 strike covered an area nearly a kilometer wide. When entire squadrons were deployed, they could obliterate everything within several square miles. American planners called it carpet bombing. To them, it was a way to deny the enemy any cover, to flatten forests, expose supply routes, and destroy tunnel networks in one devastating blow. To the men on the ground, it was something else entirely. Soldiers who witnessed a B-52 strike described the earth rising like waves of an ocean. Even miles away, the shockwaves could knock a man off his feet. The air filled with dust and shrapnel, the sky with rolling fire. The bombing wasn't just meant to kill, it was meant to terrify, to break the spirit of those who thought the jungle made them invincible. But before the B-52s could unleash their full power, they needed targets.
And that was the hardest part. The Viet Cong didn't hold cities or clear fronts. They moved constantly, hiding within civilian populations or deep inside forests so thick that even reconnaissance planes could barely detect them. American intelligence relied on radio intercepts, scout reports, and sometimes pure guesswork. When the coordinates came in, the bombers would take off from Guam or Thailand, fly hours across the South China Sea, and deliver destruction to a point marked only by a few degrees of latitude and longitude. By 1966, Arclight missions had become a daily reality of the war. The thunder of B-52s echoed over the Central Highlands, the Iron Triangle, and the Cu Chi region, places where the jungle grew like a wall of green steel. Villages vanished overnight. Craters the size of swimming pools pocked the land. Rivers changed course from the concussive force. For the Americans watching from afar, it looked like progress. Maps were redrawn, reports spoke of neutralized zones, and generals boasted of tonnage dropped. But for those who lived through it, both soldiers and civilians, it felt like the end of nature itself. Still, Washington pressed on. The belief remained unshaken that enough bombs dropped with enough precision could turn the tide. The statistics told one story. The ground told another. The Viet Cong adapted. They rebuilt tunnels deeper, reinforced bunkers with layers of bamboo and clay, and learned to read the rhythm of American bombers. Some would hide in the shadow of bombed craters, knowing the aircraft rarely hit the same area twice. Others used the destruction itself, the twisted trees and hollowed-out pits, as new defensive positions. The Americans had turned the jungle into craters. But in doing so, they had given the Viet Cong something they could never take away: experience. As the campaign escalated, both sides changed. For the U.S., the war became a contest of endurance and firepower. For the Viet Cong, it became a test of will, to survive not just bullets, but the very wrath of the sky. And soon, that wrath would reach its breaking point. The missions would grow larger, the bomb loads heavier, and the lines between strategy and desperation would begin to blur.
The jungle war was about to transform into something no one, not even the men who ordered it, fully understood.
The war had reached a new rhythm, one that pulsed with the distant rumble of bombers. By 1966, Operation Arclight was no longer an experiment. It was a daily ritual, a thunder that rose from the horizon, flattening the jungle in rolling waves. The B-52s were no longer just machines. They were a presence, unseen, untouchable, and feared by all who heard them. The aircraft themselves were monstrous. Each B-52 Stratofortress stretched nearly 50 meters in length, with wings wider than a football field. Their engines screamed as they climbed to cruising altitude, often more than 30,000 feet above the ground, far beyond the reach of any Vietnamese gun or missile. Pilots called them buffs, short for big, ugly, fat fellows. But to those below, they were the sound of judgment. From bases in Guam, Okinawa, and Thailand, crews would gather in briefing rooms hours before takeoff. They were young, many barely out of college, sitting in silence as officers read out coordinates and code names. Each mission had a target box, often nothing more than a few lines on a map. Suspected supply routes, base camps, or free-fire zones. There was rarely confirmation that anyone was even there. It didn't matter. The point was destruction. Each bomber carried up to 108 bombs, arranged in perfect order within the belly of the plane. The engineers checked every circuit, the bombardier calibrated the computers, and when the green light flashed, they climbed into the night sky. They rarely saw their targets. The bombers flew in formations of 3, cells, separated by seconds, each releasing their payload over an area nearly 2 miles long. From the cockpit, the men would feel the aircraft lift slightly as the bombs dropped away. Moments later, even from 30,000 feet, they could see the shock waves ripple across the earth. Sometimes the clouds below glowed orange. Sometimes they saw nothing at all. But the sound reached them even at altitude. The intercoms crackled, the fuselage shuddered, and the air filled with static as the explosions rolled upward. They would return to base, eat, sleep, and prepare to do it all again. For most, it felt detached, mechanical, almost sterile. They were killing by coordinates. Down below, detachment wasn't an option. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars who operated in the south, the arrival of the B-52s changed everything. Before, their greatest fear was helicopters and artillery. Now the sky itself was lethal. There was no warning. The planes flew too high to be heard until seconds before the bombs struck. The ground would tremble, animals would flee, and then a roar unlike anything human ears were meant to endure. Witnesses said the air turned solid. Entire units vanished, not from bullets, but from the sheer concussion. The shock wave could rupture lungs, tear limbs, crush men without a single piece of shrapnel touching them. Those who survived dug deeper, literally. Tunnels that had once been 2 or 3 meters underground were rebuilt to 5, then 7. Roofs were reinforced with layers of logs, clay, and stone. The Viet Cong learned to read the sky. They developed lookouts who watched for contrails, thin white lines that sometimes betrayed the approach of a B-52 group. When spotted, the word spread through the jungle like wildfire. "May by, B-52. B-52 coming." Entire villages emptied, soldiers dove into bunkers, and silence fell over the forest. Still, even the best prepared defenses could fail. The bombs came in clusters, overlapping patterns designed to leave no safe space. A single 750-pound bomb could dig a crater 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Multiply that by 100, and an entire landscape could be reshaped in minutes. American commanders studied the results from aerial photography. Before and after shots showed fields turned to moonscapes, trees gone, roads erased. To them, it was proof of success. To the Vietnamese, it was hell, carved into the soil. And yet the Viet Cong adapted again. They began using bomb craters as hiding spots, filling them with water to create makeshift ponds that disguised tunnel entrances. Some used the hollowed-out terrain to store supplies or set up ambushes for American patrols sent to inspect the damage.
In the twisted logic of war,
Even destruction became a tool of survival. Meanwhile, in Washington, the pressure grew. The war wasn't being won on television. Despite the tonnage of bombs dropped, over 100,000 tons by 1967, the Viet Cong remained active, attacks continued, and American casualties climbed. Critics argued that the bombing was indiscriminate, that it alienated civilians, that it made the jungle itself an enemy of humanity. But for the generals, it was the only language left to speak. So they made the bombers speak louder. B-52 missions grew larger, longer, and more coordinated. Intelligence teams used sensors, infrared cameras, and even acoustic devices dropped into the jungle to detect movement. Computers back in Saigon processed the data and drew target boxes where the sensors heard footsteps. Then the bombers came. The war was becoming industrial, cold, automated, relentless. In early 1968, during the Tet Offensive, the B-52s struck harder than ever. Entire regiments of North Vietnamese troops were buried beneath tons of explosives, yet even then, the shock waves of war carried both ways. American troops advancing into bombed areas found corpses mixed with shattered trees, but also the haunting evidence that many had escaped. Footprints leading into the untouched forest beyond. The jungle had been scarred, but not destroyed. As months turned into years, the B-52 became both a weapon and a symbol. For the U.S. military, it was proof of dominance, the longest reach of American power. For those below, it was the monster in the sky, the faceless god of thunder. Even American pilots began to feel the weight of what they were doing. Some wrote in diaries about the emptiness of their missions, as dropping death on dots on a map, as one put it. Others refused to look at reconnaissance photos afterward. "You don't want to know what you've done," a bombardier said in 1969. "It's easier when it's just coordinates." By then, the bombing had evolved beyond tactics. It had become strategy itself. Operations like Menu, Linebacker 1, and Linebacker 2 expanded the scope, targeting supply lines in Cambodia and Laos, and finally striking the North Vietnamese capital itself. Each escalation brought new claims of progress and new scars on the land. On the ground, the Viet Cong's morale wavered but never broke. They learned to move by night, to blend destruction into camouflage. They even used the bombings as propaganda, telling recruits that the Americans were afraid to fight face to face. For every crater, they said, another fighter would rise. And somewhere between those craters and those words, the truth of the war began to blur. The Americans could destroy anything they could see. The Viet Cong survived precisely because they could not be seen. It was a paradox that no amount of firepower could solve. The jungle, burned and torn apart, still regenerated. Rain filled the craters, and within months, green shoots began to grow again. Life, stubborn, quiet, defiant, returned. From above, it looked like victory. From below, it felt like eternity. As 1970 approached, American pilots had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than on all of Europe during World War II. The land was scarred beyond recognition, but still the war raged on. The jungle had changed form, no longer thick and endless, but cratered and wounded. Yet it still hid the same elusive enemy. The United States had proven its ability to destroy, but destruction alone was not control. And soon, that truth would explode, both in the skies over Hanoi and in the hearts of the men who ordered those bombs to fall.
It began just after dawn, the kind of morning that belonged to the jungle alone. Mist hung low between the trees, birds screamed unseen from the canopy, and the air was thick with the damp breath of the earth. The Viet Cong patrols had finished their night movements, slipping back into tunnels carved by hand in candlelight. For a few fleeting hours, there was calm, the kind of silence that only existed before something unthinkable happened. Far above that silence, 30,000 feet higher, another world was awakening. At Andersen Air Base in Guam, and later at Utapao in Thailand, the crews of the B-52 Stratofortresses, the giants of the Strategic Air Command, were preparing for Operation Arclight. Their target, the jungle itself. Coordinates that were nothing but green on every map. Suspected Viet Cong base areas, supply trails, hidden hospitals, tunnel networks. No buildings, no roads, no visible signs of life. Yet somewhere beneath those trees, thousands of fighters, weapons, and dreams of victory were hiding. The briefing room was cold, clinical. Maps filled the walls, patches of green marked Box Alpha, Box Bravo, Box Charlie. Every square inch meant hundreds of bombs. The commander's voice was steady. "Gentlemen, this is not precision, this is saturation." Each bomber carried 108 bombs, a mix of 500 and 750 pounders, over 30 tons of destruction per plane. And there would be dozens in the formation. When released together, they would strike like the fist of a god, every second dropping 10,000 pounds of TNT across a 2-mile corridor. The phrase carpet bombing was no longer a metaphor, it was reality. As the engines thundered to life, the ground trembled beneath the weight of the aircraft. Men on the tarmac shielded their faces from the hurricane of exhaust. Each B-52 looked impossibly heavy, wings sagging under the weight of death. But when they rose, the sky itself seemed to bow in silence. For the next 5 hours they would fly in tight formation, guided by radar, invisible to the men whose world they were about to erase. Down below, the Viet Cong in Tay Ninh province, near the Cambodian border, heard something faint like thunder far away. They were used to distant artillery, occasional jet passes, even air raids. But this was different. The sound didn't fade, it grew, layer upon layer, as if the entire sky were tearing open. Then came the first strike. The ground convulsed. A single bomb hit, then another and another, until the explosions merged into one continuous roar. Trees bent in waves. The air turned white. The forest floor rippled like water. Men were thrown into the air, limbs twisted, eardrums shattered. Some never even had time to scream. Those who survived the first few seconds tried to crawl, but the second wave came before they could move. Hundreds of bombs detonated simultaneously, each one digging a crater wide enough to swallow a house. The shockwaves overlapped, one explosion feeding into another, amplifying until the earth itself seemed to lose its meaning. To the men underground, it was worse. Inside the tunnels, those narrow veins of dirt that had protected them for years, the walls began to collapse. Air pressure crushed lungs, the roof caved in, the oil lamps shattered. Some were buried alive in the dark, clawing at the soil until there was no air left to breathe. The jungle screamed. The birds were gone. The insects, the snakes, the silence, all erased. The only sound was the sky. From the air, it was beautiful in a monstrous way. The bombardier's voice was calm as he counted down the final release. 3, 2, 1. Pickle. And then, like rain, the bombs fell, black dots streaming downward through layers of clouds. For the pilots, it was mechanical. They never saw the faces, they never felt the heat, but they could see the shock waves, perfect circles expanding outward, erasing the jungle in real time. Each impact sent columns of smoke spiraling upward, merging into a single roiling storm. From 30,000 feet, Vietnam looked like another planet.
When the formation turned away, the navigator logged the strike time, 0942 local. The bombardier marked the target neutralized. They didn't know that below them, hundreds of men had ceased to exist in less than 60 seconds. But the horror didn't end there. Hours later, when the survivors emerged from what remained of their tunnels, they found a world they no longer recognized. The jungle canopy, gone. The trees reduced to jagged splinters. The air still vibrating with aftershock. The earth was nothing but overlapping craters, steam rising from the mud, the smell of iron and burned leaves filling every breath. They had no bearings, no landmarks. Even the paths they had walked every day were gone, erased by the geometry of explosions. A young fighter named Pam Dui later recalled, "It was like the gods were angry. The earth opened, the sky screamed. There was nowhere to hide. We were ants under a falling boot." Elsewhere, an American forward observer watched the same bombardment from miles away. His radio crackled with the call sign, "Arc light completed." He whispered, "There's nothing left alive in that grid." His voice wasn't triumphant. It was hollow, like a man who'd just seen the end of the world and didn't know what to feel. The Viet Cong began calling it the Sky Fire. To them, the B-52 wasn't a plane. It was a myth, a demon that lived above the clouds, one that could erase entire battalions without being seen. Some claimed they could feel the bombs before hearing them, the pressure slamming into their chests, the ground boiling beneath their feet. Others swore they saw lightning made of dust, orange, red, and black, that stayed in the air for hours after the strike. In the following weeks, U.S. forces returned to the bombed zones. Helicopters hovered over the wasteland, their rotors whipping dust into the air. There were no trees to mark coordinates. Soldiers walked through fields of ash, stepping into craters so wide they swallowed jeeps whole. They found shrapnel embedded in what was once living wood, now twisted metal. Even the rivers had changed course. It wasn't just destruction, it was recreation. The jungle reborn into something unrecognizable. For the Viet Cong, the terror went beyond the explosions. They learned that the bombers came without warning. There were no sirens, no jet screams, no shadows to alert them. One moment there was quiet, the next annihilation. The phrase instant death took on a new meaning. It wasn't fear of dying, it was fear of not even knowing when it would happen. Psychological warfare took hold. In villages near the bombed zones, civilians dug new shelters, not for artillery, but for the sky. Farmers refused to work their fields. Children flinched at thunder, mistaking it for the sound of another raid. The jungle that once protected them now betrayed them. Open, scarred, unrecognizable. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force saw success in numbers. Dozens of operations like this followed: Arclight, Rolling Thunder, Linebacker. The bombing tonnage reached astronomical levels. Millions of tons of ordnance dropped over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But for every crater created, another question grew in Washington. If the jungle was gone, where was victory? Yet on the ground, there was no philosophy, only survival. In one of the bombed areas, an NVA medic found a survivor, half buried in mud, face covered in dust. He was alive but blind, his eyes burned by flash and soil. When asked what happened, the man whispered, "The sky fell." Then he died. For the rest of the war, every time the distant thunder rolled across the mountains, every Viet Cong soldier knew the B-52s were coming again. When the smoke cleared, the land was unrecognizable. What had once been an endless green ocean of trees and life now stretched into a wasteland of scars. The earth had been rearranged, not by time, not by erosion, but by men who commanded the sky. The craters were everywhere, layered like scales across the land. Some were shallow bowls filled with rainwater. Others were deep enough to swallow trucks. Together they formed a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet, a jungle turned inside out. In the villages nearby, the survivors emerged slowly, blinking through the haze. Their ears still rang, their skin coated in ash. Many couldn't find their homes because there was no direction anymore. Landmarks had vanished. Forest trails that once connected hamlets had been vaporized. Even the rivers had changed course under the pressure of the blasts. "The jungle used to breathe," one villager said. "Now it just holds its breath." For the Viet Cong, the psychological damage was worse than the physical one. Their tunnels, once a symbol of ingenuity. When the smoke cleared, the land was unrecognizable. What had once been an endless green ocean of trees and life now stretched into a wasteland of scars. The earth had been rearranged, not by time, not by erosion, but by men who commanded the sky. The craters were everywhere, layered like scales across the land. Some were shallow bowls filled with rainwater. Others were deep enough to swallow trucks. Together, they formed a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet, a jungle turned inside out. In the villages nearby, the survivors emerged slowly, blinking through the haze. Their ears still rang, their skin coated in ash. Many couldn't find their homes because there was no direction anymore. Landmarks had vanished. Forest trails that once connected hamlets had been vaporized. Even the rivers had changed course under the pressure of the blasts. "The jungle used to breathe," one villager said. "Now it just holds its breath." For the Viet Cong, the psychological damage was worse than the physical one. Their tunnels, once a symbol of ingenuity and resistance, had become graves. The underground cities of Cu Chi, Tainan, and the Iron Triangle were no longer safe. Each airstrike collapsed more sections. Even the bravest fighters began to question whether the earth could still protect them. "We lived like ghosts," recalled one survivor. "Every rumble in the distance made our hearts stop. The bombers were gods. They chose who lived and who vanished." American intelligence teams soon followed the destruction, photographing the devastation from the air. Black and white images revealed nothing but gray craters, geometry without life. In Washington, these pictures were celebrated as proof of dominance. The Pentagon called the strikes effective neutralization. Yet on the ground, the results were far more ambiguous. The jungle was gone, yes, but so were the civilians, the fields, the water sources. Entire ecosystems had disappeared overnight. The U.S. military dropped over 2.7 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, more than all bombs used by all sides in World War II combined. In some provinces, the soil became sterile. Seeds would not take root. The rain pooled in the craters, turning them into stagnant lakes of mud and mosquitoes. Nature had been broken. Even decades later, satellite images still show the outlines of those bomb scars, like fingerprints of an old wound that never healed. In Laos and Cambodia, where the B-52s expanded their missions, the aftermath was even worse. Unexploded ordnance littered the ground, silent killers that would remain deadly for generations. Farmers plowing their fields unearthed rusted bombs decades later. Children played near them without knowing. The war ended, but the bombs stayed. For the American crews, the emotional aftermath came slower, quieter. Many of them never saw the destruction they caused. They operated at 30,000 feet, watching through radar screens and coordinates. But when photographs reached their bases, some couldn't look. The sterile language of targets and payloads no longer protected them. They saw villages where there had once been forests, and emptiness where there had once been life. "We thought we were hitting the enemy," one bombardier later confessed, "but all I saw was earth turned into fire." Strategically, the bombings achieved mixed results. They forced the Viet Cong to adapt, to dig deeper, move faster, scatter wider. They slowed supply routes, but did not break the will to fight. In fact, many historians argue that the devastation hardened North Vietnam's resolve. What was meant to destroy morale instead deepened hatred, binding the population in shared suffering. Yet for those on the ground, politics didn't matter. They buried their dead where they could.
Some planted banana trees in the craters, small green symbols of defiance growing in the wounds of war. Over time, the jungle began to return, timidly, leaf by leaf. But the scars never truly disappeared. Today, if you walk through parts of Quang Tri, Tay Ninh, or the Cambodian borderlands, you can still see them. Thousands of circular depressions scattered through the forest floor, filled with rainwater, overgrown with reeds. Each one marks a moment when the sky fell. Each one is a memory, silent but enduring. And yet, despite all the destruction, both sides would continue the fight. The bombers had changed the landscape, but not the outcome. The jungle could be burned, but not the idea of resistance. The war would rage for years after the last B-52 left the sky, a reminder that even total destruction can't erase human determination. In the end, the bombers proved what technology could do, but also what it could never conquer. The jungle grew back, the people rebuilt, and the memory of those days, when the sky rained fire and the earth became a graveyard, remained as one of the darkest chapters in modern warfare. Even now, when thunder rolls across the Vietnamese countryside, old men sometimes pause, listening to the distance, remembering. Because to them, thunder will always sound like bombers returning.
The war in Vietnam would rage on for nearly a decade after the first B-52 strike turned the jungle into dust. The planes came and went, the coordinates changed, the maps were redrawn again and again. But the craters remained, silent monuments to a time when men believed they could command nature itself. From the air, the scars looked small, like dimples on the surface of the earth. But down below, they were oceans, wide, deep, and heavy with memory. Villagers built their homes around them, children swam in them, and soldiers who once hid beneath the ground now walked past them in silence. The land had been forever rewritten by the thunder of wings and fire. For the Americans, the bombing symbolized both triumph and tragedy, the ultimate display of modern power and the clearest proof of its limits. No matter how many bombs fell, the war refused to yield. For every forest burned, another seemed to grow back. For every crater carved into the earth, another Viet Cong fighter emerged from the shadows. In the end, the bombers did not win the war. They only deepened its echo. But perhaps the real story lies not in the explosions, but in what followed. The silence that came after. The generations who grew up among those craters, turning places of death into ponds of life. The farmers who reclaimed the scorched earth, and the veterans who returned decades later, staring at the same ground that had once trembled beneath their engines. War has a way of erasing things, faces, voices, even history itself. But the land remembers. It carries the shapes of violence in its soil, the whispers of those who once fought above and below it. Today, the jungles of Vietnam have reclaimed much of what was lost. But when you fly over certain regions, especially near the Cambodian border, you can still see them, thousands of circles scattered across the green. Each one tells a story of fire and fear, of human ambition and its cost. In the end, the Viet Cong were terrified, not just by the bombs, but by what they represented, a force beyond human scale, a storm no man could fight. And yet, they endured. They survived the sky itself. As the dust settled and the years turned, both nations were left to face the same truth, that even the greatest machines ever built cannot destroy the human will to fight, to rebuild, and to remember. Because long after the bombers vanished from the skies, their echoes remained, rolling through history like distant thunder,
reminding us that power, no matter how absolute, always leaves a shadow. Next time, we'll explore another weapon born from that same belief in unstoppable force. A machine designed not to flatten jungles, but to dominate the air. The helicopter that became both the lifeline and the heartbreak of the Vietnam War.